Hello and good evening, everyone. Welcome to the National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar series. Tonight's session is titled Post-1990s Developments in China's Relationship to the World. And I'm very pleased to be joined by Xing from Brandeis University. My name is Andy Mink, and I'm the Vice President of Education at the National Humanities Center. I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight. I often comment, and I always acknowledge that each of you are essentially doing work after work. You know, you spent the day with your classes. You've likely, if you're on the West Coast, just dismissed your classes recently. I think that actually goes triplicate for this time of year. I know the space between Thanksgiving and Christmas break has its own weird, surreal feeling. There's a lot going on. You've got personal and professional duties pulling you in a variety of directions, and we cannot thank you more for spending some time with us this evening to have this conversation and to really explore this topic in ways that it might impact your teaching. If at any point tonight you lose track of my voice or the screen seems to somehow be disrupted, my first line of advice would be to simply log out of the room and come right back in. The room will stay open, it'll stay live, and you will not disrupt us at all if you do so. If you still haven't been able to resolve the problem, then maybe check your settings, check your volume, check your earbuds. And if worst case scenario, please give me a direct message and I'll do my best to help you behind the scenes. I also want to thank my education team at the center, Libby Taylor and Mike Williams, for all their hard work. Libby is our primary contact with scholars when they prepare for the webinars and other events. Mike Williams is the master of our online course catalog, as well as our many of our face-to-face presentations and workshops. One of the things that our team really focuses on in the work that we do at the center is to really acknowledge and try to embrace the leadership and the agency of all the educators that we're working with. Between the three of us, we have 27 years in the public school classroom, and it's very, very important for us to bring that professionalism that each of you have in your classroom to the work we do and try to make it as relevant as we can to your daily business. Please feel free to reach out to us at any point through Twitter, through email. Let us know if there are things that you'd like us to work on or to improve or to change or to highlight, and we'll be happy to do just that. I'm also very pleased tonight to be able to introduce and co-sponsor tonight's session with Primary Source. Joining us tonight is Deb Cunningham, and Deb, I've just unmuted you. Actually, you're up in Boston. I'm down in Chapel Hill, and it's always important for us, I think, to collaborate, to find like-minded partners who are not only working in this space but who understand the value of the humanities. And I wonder if you could share just a little bit about Primary Source with us.
Sure, Andy, I'd be happy to, and thanks so much for partnering with us on this webinar. It's always, the Humanities in Class webinars are a series we greatly admire, so it's always a pleasure to work with you and be some small part of it, especially since I have to restrain myself from signing up from all of them. They're a great series. Primary Source does similar type of work in the Boston area and online. About 50% of our work now does happen in the online space. And our central mission is to work with teachers to advance global learning. Global histories, cultures, and issues are the focus of it. And we strive to make that accessible in as many forms as we can, whether through online courses that range from 4 weeks to 8 weeks, or webinars, or modules on world history, on cultural responsiveness, on the kinds of topics you can see right here in this slide, just to take a sample of 3 of them. We also offer a range of multimedia online resources, which are shown in this slide. We have a toolkit on how you can work to build global schools. We have publications on China and on African American history and many other subjects that you can find in our website under publications, or in Primary Source World, which is a globally oriented set of primary source resources, including some that focus on the arts of ancient and traditional China. So we encourage you to check these resources out for further learning after the webinar, and feel free to join from anywhere in the country. I'm excited, having spent a summer in LA, to see so many teachers here from LA, as well as lots of other states. So we hope to make our work accessible to all of you and to support deeper learning about China, which from our founding 30 years ago has been a very important country to the work of our organization. Thanks, Andy.
Absolutely, Deb. Thank you so much for sharing that. And from our point of view at the center, this is not just a matter of co-branding and sort of finding somewhat random ways to collaborate, but rather like-minded folks in the same space can only amplify and magnify the resources that we put in the hands of teachers. And so I'm really pleased to be able to continue to work with Primary Source and encourage all of our attendees tonight, including Mark Sweeney, who's here from sunny Cave Creek, Arizona, to go and spend time on their website and check out their resources. The National Humanities Center is located in Durham, North Carolina, and you can visit the building, you can meet with our fellows, you can see the work we do, or you can go to our website, which also is a good indication, shows you a good indication of the bridges that we try to create between the scholarly world and the world of the classroom. What we like to do is to apply the humanities to help understand contemporary questions, to help understand communities and the ways in which we connect with them, and to really offer a very specific and clear disciplinary lens to do so. Of course, your job, our job, is to help translate this role of the humanities, this value in the humanities, to the classroom for students of all ages. And so if you explore our website, you can not only find the digital assets and resources available, but I think most importantly, and this is where it ties back into the work we do with Deb and Primary Source, you have access to the network of humanists and of scholars who are constantly, every single day, trying to make sense of this ever increasingly complicated world that we're living in. A couple of reminders about tonight's webinar. This will be an audio-only webinar, meaning you'll see the PowerPoint as well as hear the voices of Professor Hang and myself, but you are still a very important participant. Please do use the chat box, as many of you have done so far, to introduce yourself. Good friends like Jacqueline Dukes, who seems to be at all of our webinars. Jacqueline needs to have some kind of temporary National Humanities Center pass for all the webinars she attends. Tim in Raleigh, just down the road, Karen Day and all of her friends in Los Angeles, Amanda in Marietta, Georgia. You guys are really what's driving this conversation. And so please do use that chat box to register questions, to share thoughts, perhaps other resources. And Deb, I'm going to ask you to go ahead and use that chat box to also respond and ask questions and maybe share a little bit more about Primary Source as you see it, if it's relevant and applicable to the conversation we're having. My job as the moderator then is to bring those questions to the professor and integrate those into our evening discussions. So the more you talk, the more we can share exactly what's relevant and important for you. I've got a few logistical reminders before we get started with tonight's session. The first is to announce that we do have a few open seats for the remaining webinars. Later this week, Thursday, in fact, we'll be working with Erica Lee at the University of Minnesota. Her session is titled Asian Americans, the fastest growing group in the United States. And when I looked right before I turned this room on tonight, there were 4 seats open. So if you're interested in that topic, please go ahead and sign up as soon as you can. First come, first serve. We also have a session in April with Akram Khader, former fellow at the center and currently a professor of history at North Carolina State, titled Understanding the Modern Middle East. There are 95 seats left for that. And if you've signed up for Johnny Smith's session on Jackie Robinson and civil rights history, we did have to reschedule that from this December to later in the spring, April 28th, due to a family conflict. Finally, I'd like to announce in terms of the webinars that we've asked all of you who have registered for webinars to attend what you've signed up for, and if you can't make it, to let us know so we can release that seat and add someone from our waiting list. For those of you who did attend 100% of the webinars you signed up for, I'll be sending a special VIP private link on Friday. That's a day after our last webinar of the semester. To this next session, this is scheduled for January the 7th. We'll be working with Mark Aronson and Marina Burgos on the global history of sugar and the barbaric history of sugar, particularly as it relates to the 1619 project. And so that session will be available to those of you who have attended, all of which you've signed up for. A couple other announcements in terms of upcoming work and possibilities, opportunities for you. We are currently accepting applications for a 10-day summer institute that will be hosted at the National Humanities Center in July. Applications will be accepted until March 1st, and the title of the institute is The Contested Territory, America's Role in Southeast Asia, 1945 to 75. This will be not just an institute on the Vietnam War, although that's certainly a part of it, but rather the entire context, the landscape of the humanities landscape of that region for the 40 years, 30 years that are listed. We also have an online course catalog that is currently open and accepting registration. We've got 8 courses scheduled for the spring, and each of them come with about 30 PD hours, particularly for you folks in Los Angeles. I know that a lot of your salary points are identified with this, so the online course catalog will also is also eligible for the certification that you need for that work. And finally, particularly for those of you located in Southern California, the center will be co-hosting an institute for teachers at the Huntington Museum in March. We'd love for you to join. Libby, Mike, and myself, all of whom will be there for Friday night in an all-day Saturday event. Our focus will be on the role of museums and institutions on civil discourse. And we'd love to have you join. We're currently accepting applications there. Each year we work with a teacher advisory council. This year we have 20 teachers from across the country who help keep us honest, frankly, help keep us relevant. And I hope that the work that we do is applicable to the current classroom. I want to thank all of our teaching advisory council members from the last 4 and 5 years for the hard work that they've contributed. If any of you, particularly those of you in the Los Angeles Unified District, would like to join this advisory council next year, we'll be accepting applications starting in April, and I'd encourage you to keep your eye out for that. So that's my introduction of the center and for the night, but really we are here to learn more about the role of China in world events in the last 20 years, and I'm very pleased that Xing has been able to join us. He's at Brandeis University in Boston. Professor, can you hear me?
Yes, can you hear me?
I can, thank you. And I do want to appreciate, again, thank you for being here with us. And tonight's session will be a conversation that you're leading, but again, my job as the moderator is to bring questions from the audience to you, and we can have those in sort of conversational style. And I'll be advancing the slides for you, so I'm pretty good usually sort of getting a sense of when you want to advance, but if I'm running behind, just let me know, just simply and casually ask me and I'll advance them for you.
Okay.
And I'd actually like to start with one question just to kind of open this. This will be our icebreaker question, if you don't mind, and it's a little off script, so I'm going to put you on the spot. But I think I'd like to know from your perspective, teachers, all the folks in the room tonight most of them work with pre-collegiate students. And in my own experience in the classroom and when I work with teachers, we often talk about unlearning or unteaching the kinds of assumptions and misperceptions that students bring into the classroom. And I'm curious from your perspective, given tonight's topic, what would you say are some of the most common misperceptions of modern China, the things that you hear maybe from your own students or from the world that we live in? What would you say are some of the biggest misunderstandings?
That's a really good question, Andy. I think a lot of perceptions of China, that come from the media, that come from schooling, that come from what people every day are exposed to. I mean, there's a certain element of truth to them. But at the same time, I would say that the reality is far more complex. So I think one example would be you know, China being a communist country that practices a command economy. If you go to China, that is far from the truth. I mean, you know, the markets, um, the sort of entrepreneurial spirit, uh, in some cases exceed those of capitalist countries. But at the same time, if you look at all of this economic activity, it is still subject to oftentimes very heavy government supervision. So, I mean, you know, there once again, you know, the conception of a communist country, there is an element of truth to it,
Yeah,
but at the same time, the reality is far more complex.
yeah, absolutely. I hadn't intended to ask you this necessarily, but I feel compelled to follow up if you don't
Oh,
mind.
no problem at all.
I'm going to flip that on you a little bit and say, from your perspective, from your research, from the work you've done, what would you say is the biggest misperception about the United States from the Chinese perspective?
Well, I think in terms of the United States among Chinese people, there are there's two perceptions, I think. One perception is a very rosy one
Hmm.
that the U.S. is um, incredibly ideal as a society, where people are harmonious, where everybody is very rich. It's a very prosperous place. It's a place with plenty of opportunities. So I think that's one perception.
Yeah.
Another perception is the very negative one, where there's a lot of violence, killings take place every single day. Um, it's it's not very safe, and so yeah. So there's I think two poles on the extreme
Mm.
among average Chinese people.
Yeah. Yeah, it strikes me, hearing Deb talk about the global studies perspective and me discussing and sort of sharing, framing the ways that the humanities might lead to greater understanding. It seems like in some ways it's breaking through those misunderstandings that might be the key. And I'm really glad that you can share with us this kind of work tonight, hopefully to start to dispel some of that. I've advanced to your first slide. Thank you for answering that. And as we move through this, maybe we can keep that framing question in mind for all the participants.
Yeah, thank you so much, Andy. And by the way, thank you, uh, thanks to the National Humanities Center for putting this together. I also want to extend my appreciation to Deb and Primary Source. I worked with Primary Source on several occasions with teachers, and it's a pleasure to join all of you in a virtual format. And thank you to all of the audience. I wish I had the chance to get to know each and every one of you, but thank you for attending this webinar. So I'm going to be talking about, as the title mentions, post-1990s developments in China's relationship to the world. So it's a focus on China's foreign relations and how it positions itself in relation to the international order after the Tiananmen Square affair, Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989. And I am a historian by training. And what I'm going to try to do is to historicize the period from 1990 up until 2019 in the present day. I mean, all too often, this, this 20-year chunk of time has been mostly relegated to the realm of political science. And most history works on China, even scholarly textbooks at the college level, pretty much end in 1989 with Tiananmen as a very crucial kind of event. But I think it's about time, since we're well into the 21st century and actually approaching the third decade of the 21st century. I think that historical timeline needs to be updated. So this particular webinar will be my attempt to historicize this period. And I've made several attempts to do the same in my classes at the university level, and also at a similar lecture with primary source several months ago. And I just want to warn you before I begin that this kind of historical presentation is in many ways my kind of take, my kind of interpretation on this historical trajectory. I may have selectively left out some things. I may have selectively chosen some things. So I just want to put it out before you that it's not an absolutely objective perspective or one that is completely clear of the biases of the present day, given the media, given that, the events after 1989 are extremely high stakes, even in today's, for today's world, for today's politics, economics, everything. Okay, so on that note, we're going to begin. So 1989, June the 4th, that's happened. The crackdown occurred. Deng Xiaoping ordered the crackdown on this massive movement in Tiananmen Square on June the 4th, 1989. The crackdown raised an international outcry, and China came under unprecedented international isolation and economic sanctions since the détente between China and the United States in 1972. And between 1989 and 1991, China's leadership started to move away from economic reforms, the introduction of market mechanisms, capitalism, that it had been doing in the 1980s. The leadership viewed this as too great of a risk because of what happened at Tiananmen Square. However, there were two crucial events that quickly changed the mind of Deng Xiaoping. And Deng Xiaoping, even though he had no official post in the Chinese leadership, he was a party elder, and his words carried the most weight. And he was able to change the course of the party. So one event, as Andy has already shown in the slide, is the Persian Gulf War, where Saddam Hussein of Iraq, at the time, he had a very strong military, powerful air force. He was crushed by the U.S. After he tried to invade Kuwait. And this was an awesome demonstration of American military power. It actually sent shockwaves through the Chinese military establishment that, even with conventional military power, the U.S. cannot be resisted. The second key event that was also incredibly traumatic for the Communist Party leadership was the collapse of the Soviet Union. And in fact, events even beforehand, which is the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Eastern Bloc. The death of the Soviet Union in 1991 was essentially the climactic final moment of these drawn-out events. And the Chinese leadership, when looking at the Soviet collapse, they viewed it simultaneously with relief, but also with a great sense of impending doom. Relief in the sense that the Soviet Union and China had been at odds with one another since the 1960s. And the Soviets were, at the time, a much greater threat than the United States. And we could go on forever for that, but we're not going to talk about it. But the collapse of the Soviet Union was also tremendously threatening for China's leadership, because they felt that, if measures were not taken to improve the livelihood of the Chinese people, the Communist Party of China will be next. So these two events really triggered a change in course on the part of the party leadership led by Deng Xiaoping. So in 1992, 1 year after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Persian Gulf War, he took a tour to southern China, where some of the most advanced and economically open to the outside world cities were. One of these was Shenzhen. And Shenzhen was a special economic zone. This meant that many capitalist and market mechanisms were practiced in Shenzhen that was not current at the time in the rest of the country, which, although there were market mechanisms, primarily ran on a command economic model. So Deng Xiaoping took a southern tour of these special economic zones. And here you see him surveying a disc production plant. And this is, I think, an LCD, a laser disc. I'm not sure how many of you remember this. I remember this. It used to be seen as the cutting edge of technology.
Listen,
CD-ROM.
I'm going to tell you, Professor, there was nothing better in a classroom in the mid-90s than to have that big Bluetooth player rather than the VHS tape, so you knew exactly where to start something. So yeah, that's
Right.
a fantastic technology. Mike Cesario, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask for a clarifying question. Mike has
Right.
asked if you can explain a little bit more in depth what a command economic model is.
Yeah, absolutely. No problem, Mike. And I just saw your question in the chat box, and I was about to get to you. A command economic model essentially is the state running the market, the state setting production quotas, and then however much is produced, the state then sells these things in government-owned shops. And although in the 1980s, China moved largely away from that, some of the crucial economic sectors remained in the hands of what are known as state-owned enterprises. And these enterprises operated according to this model. And I see Mark's question about the Nye initiative on China specifically and Asia generally. So, if you could juggle my memory here, can you give me a background on what the Nye initiative is? I'm sorry.
That's a
Yeah.
deep cut, Mark Sweeney.
Yeah.
And he might be able to pull it up. And if you like, we can keep going and swing back to it.
Yeah. Well, I'll get back to you a little bit.
Yeah, let's pin that. And Mark, if you don't mind reminding us of the Nye initiative, not with a link, but with a short description, then Professor can respond. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. So he's serving a disc production plant in Shenzhen, and because of the southern tour, Deng Xiaoping essentially said with this message that openness towards the outside world, especially the West, was crucial for the future of the Chinese people, but more importantly, the future of the Chinese government and the party to remain relevant to China's development. And as a result of that tour, the party made a very crucial decision, which had two elements to it. And this gets us to stage one of the post-Tiananmen history, running from around 1992 to 2003. And stage one essentially consists of economic integration into the world order led by the United States. There was a realization on the part of the Chinese leadership that if that economic integration were not to occur, China would become something like what North Korea is today, completely economically isolated, and essentially left behind in the growing globalization, right? But at the same time, in tandem with the economic integration, um, there was the need to maintain the political system and the monopoly of the Chinese Communist Party in power. So this was the kind of twin approach that the Chinese leadership took. And Andy, I think we should change the slides.
Sure.
Yeah. So yeah, this pretty much sums up what I've been talking about. But at the same time, the maintenance of the political monopoly as well as economic integration will not challenge U.S. dominance. So it was encapsulated in a policy known as, it's a classical Chinese saying, biding one's time and concealing one's thought. So this was the approach of the Chinese leadership throughout the 1990s. Now, from the United States, and I see Mark's kind of comment of the U.S. concerns about China's foreign policy ambitions. So what is the U.S. interest in drawing China into the international order? And so the U.S. approach to China in the face of changing Chinese policies led by Deng Xiaoping was something known as soft containment. And I talk about this in the next slide. The soft containment contains two elements. All right, one is the soft side, and this is known as engagement. This is the use of diplomacy, of frequent official and unofficial contacts to really welcome China into the international order, which was led by the United States. And by drawing China into the international order, there's a political aim and an economic aim. The political aim is really influence the perception of Chinese elites towards liberal democracy. So democracy, liberal democracy according to the U.S. model, was seen as the ultimate end goal of every single political system, and that the Chinese leadership, by seeing the benefits and the advanced nature of the U.S. political system, would be encouraged to do the same in their country. The economic side was encouraging China to engage in deep-seated structural reforms to facilitate multinational investment. So investment of multinational companies like Coca-Cola, like Apple, Google, all these multinational firms, and to liberalize capital flows. Okay, so the U.S. really saw potential in China as a production base and also an incredible market. At the same time, there was cultural influence, right? The belief that the Chinese can be just like us. So you have this image of a Chinese man holding a bottle of Coke. This is, really one of the faces of globalization. And globalization was really the key word, the catchword of the 1990s, right? Everything is supposed to be global. And the icons of globalization, one is Coca-Cola, the other is jeans, all of these quintessentially American items spreading throughout the world. And this cultural influence had a lot to do with the other aims, political and economic. So the other element of soft containment is hard containment, in which the U.S. military presence and alliance systems did not go away. And in fact, it strengthened to a certain extent in the post-Cold War period throughout the 1990s. So if you look at this map, the U.S. continued to strengthen her alliance with Japan and South Korea. Around this time, again going to Mark, there was a bolstering of Taiwan's role. So the kind of strengthening of semi-official contacts with Taiwan, alliances with the Philippines, and also the bolstering of the U.S. presence in the Strait of Malacca. So you can see, a very heavy U.S. troop presence in the region to really ensure kind of Chinese compliance with U.S. Global strategic aims. Right? And you can also see from then, if you're looking at a Chinese perspective, why the South China Sea is so important, because that's actually a very critical way from the Chinese perspective of breaking what it sees as a U.S. encirclement of allies. Okay, but this is kind of getting ahead. Okay, so we've talked about the Chinese aims for entering into this kind of cooperation with the U.S. global order, and we also talked about the U.S. motivations. So how was this specifically carried out? Well, Deng Xiaoping, after his after his crucial southern tour in 1992, he faded out of the scene, and he would pass away in 1997. And the crucial implementation of the Chinese strategic aims was carried out during the 1990s by the president and party secretary, Jiang Zemin, and the premier or prime minister, Zhu Rongji. And Zhu Rongji especially was the front man for implementing economic policies in China. So let's briefly look at some of the economic policies of the 1990s. This included welcoming the once suppressed capitalist and property classes into the party. Okay, so big capitalists, landowners, not a problem at all. As long as you love the country, you too can be a member of the Communist Party. All right, so that's one measure, because traditionally the Communist Party represented the interests of the workers and the peasants against these oppressor classes. So the second measure is the dismantling and corporatization of state-owned firms. So in answer to, I think, an individual in the chat box earlier, the question of command economy. So the command economy really ended to a large degree during the mid-1990s, when a lot of state-owned firms, if they were not profitable, they were going to be privatized. If they were profitable, they would be restructured according to a corporate model, just like multinational corporations in the US. The special economic zones in the coastal cities would continue to operate, and China pursued largely an export-oriented economy. In other words, China's domestic market would be sort of not opened up that much, and instead the focus would be on production, large-scale production for markets in the United States, in Western Europe, and Japan. So that was what was done in the 1990s in terms of economic reforms. And you're absolutely right, Deb, incredibly capitalist. And to a certain extent, even more capitalist than many of the Western countries. And the spirit of the times was encapsulated with this sign, this poster board in Shenzhen, a special economic zone that says, time is money, efficiency is life. If you could put that on, Andy. I think it's right there. Yep, shown right here. Time is money, efficiency is life. And this capitalism is incredibly cutthroat. Large numbers of workers in state-owned enterprises were laid off during the 1990s. And the 1990s was also a time of a lot of labor unrest by discontented workers. Peasants were, in fact, driven from the countryside in huge numbers to work in the big cities, in multinational firms, and also the sort of newly privatized state-owned enterprises. So, these peasants also were very discontent because when they go to the cities, they were treated differently. So Mark asked, what were the actual CCP's motives for this reform? On the one hand, to please the U.S., so for the Communist Party to survive. But secondly, under the former state-owned enterprises in the command economy, things weren't very efficient because, there wasn't much competition. There wasn't much efficiency in how things were done. And so by doing so, it actually allows for incredibly rapid economic growth. It's actually good for the economy. So coupled with economic reforms, introducing market and capitalistic elements into the economy, the Chinese government used nationalism as a means of highlighting the Chinese characteristics of the socialism with Chinese characteristics, which was the Communist Party's monopoly on power. So nationalism was really promoted. So China as formerly a great country, and that the Communist Party's goal was to rejuvenate China and make it great again. And so, in fact, during the 1990s, when there were diplomatic disputes with the United States, such as the time in 1999 when NATO warplanes, whether by accident or not, struck the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, in the former Yugoslavia, it prompted nationwide protests that were encouraged by the government as a means of fueling Chinese solidarity behind the party, and also sort of drawing away or distracting from a lot of the economic problems that occurred during the transition to a more market economy. So the strategy paid off. By the end of the 20th century, China was even more welcomed into the global order. In 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization, signaling that it became a full-fledged member of the international community of economic partners. So the WTO was a tremendous boon for China. But you also want to keep in mind, it's not just beneficial for the Chinese side. It was also beneficial for the United States and the entire world order. So now we move into the 21st century. So year 2000 has rolled by, and we get a new group of leaders at the helm of the People's Republic. So after Jiang Zemin and Zhu Rongji stepped down, they were succeeded by the president of China and also the secretary of the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, Hu Jintao, who came to power in 2003, together with Premier Wen Jiabao. And once again, in China, the premier would be the individual responsible for implementing economic policy. So this ushers in stage 2 of China's history, post-1989. And this ran for about a decade between 2003 and 2013. And really, in retrospect, despite all of the problems of that decade, the world at the time, especially in light of today's, fast-changing crisis, the world back then seemed really great. And one key reason for that was what you see here, the formation of a global economic symbiosis, where each of the different countries in the world had a role to play in fueling the economic system. So in this order, the U.S., the European Union, and Japan were at the top of the chain. They were the leaders in technology. They had the upper end manufacturing, the brand names. They provided the services, financial services, their centers of education, everything. Now, the second tier of this would be what were known as the Asian tigers. So South Korea, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore, and you could also consider the overseas Chinese as a group as well. They were sort of the intermediaries. They would take Western, U.S., European, and Japanese technology and manufacturing. They would sell them to other markets. And they themselves were the producers of middle-end goods and services. And here you see China. And China, during those 10 years, was probably the only and the largest factory of the world, producing all kinds of mass consumer items consumed around the world. Not just in the US, but in all of the countries, you find Chinese products. And then finally, supplying the natural resources like oil, timber, I see rare earth metals, right? Things like that. These would fall into the hands of natural resource producers. Oops, typo there. But natural resource producers like Russia and Saudi Arabia.
I've got a couple of questions,
Mhm.
maybe to clarify some of this. And the first is actually just the ways in which you've structured your talk tonight. You know, one of the advantages of this for our educators in the audience is that you really are curating resources in a timeline that just doesn't exist in most textbooks. And as you said at the beginning, it's you noticed the gap yourself and decided that post 1990 is when we really needed to tell this narrative, to bring these things together. So when you talk about the stages, you're now in the second. I think you have at least one more to go. Is that your own taxonomy? You have decided when these stages start and stop, and sort of when the hinge might be between them?
Absolutely, Andy.
Okay.
This is what I've devised based upon my understanding of the events that have happened since 1989, because there simply isn't any good textbook that can encapsulate that period.
Yeah.
So yeah, it is kind of my own taxonomy. It's arbitrary in a ways. I feel like this is something that I could perfect as time goes on.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's really an advantage to the audience. And I want to remind everyone that we're recording tonight's session. You'll have access to the video of tonight's talk and be able to kind of go back through and maybe digest this a little bit more slowly. But it's really nice to know that an expert in the field, that you with an historian's eye is able to go back and make sense of the last 2 decades. My second question then, which is very similar maybe, is about this particular stage two, and you've set it up and you've described it in terms of tiers 1, 2, 3, and 4. And tiers imply, a vertical importance. The top tier versus the lower tier. And I wonder if the countries in this grid, in this puzzle, saw it that way, or was it more of a flat hierarchy where everyone understands their place, they understand the ways in which each of the tiers interact and supports each other, and that in and of itself was fulfilling. Is this more of a vertical tier where where countries are trying to move up, or is it just simply the way things connected?
That's a great question, Andy. And I would say that it has vertical and horizontal elements.
Yeah.
Vertical in the sense that if you look during this period, where most of the capital is located, where most of the technology, I mean, it's undoubtedly those three places. And those three places are also, all the other countries, they know their place. They know that these places that the U.S., Europe, and Japan are very advanced, and they want products and technology from those places. And these are also great places to immigrate and to get an education. So I think that there's definitely a clear sense of who's at the top. But at the same time, it is horizontal because everybody benefited. Um, because the capital, they and the production and everything, they flow from one place to another. Boundaries have broken down, and a factory, for instance, in China, or discovering oil in Saudi Arabia to sell to China or to the West, it turns out very profitable for each of these places, and they could use the money to build up themselves. So in a ways, it is a symbiosis. People all depend on each other. But within that symbiosis, there certainly is a hierarchy. But I think at this point, everybody was, of course you have your gripes and complaints, right? But I think everybody was fine because everybody benefited to a certain extent. Does
Yeah,
that
that
answer your
makes sense.
question?
It certainly does. And I'd also like to remind everyone in the room that Deb Cunningham has just listed a link to some current resources on China in the world that may be a good place to follow up with these questions. But thank you for walking us through that, Professor.
No problem. And feel free to ask questions at any point. Any one of you, chat box, if you want to interject, Andy. And
Will
I'll
do.
be happy to clarify. So let's look at this chart right here, and this is actually jumping right off of what I'm talking about in terms of global symbiosis, because in the case of China, it's actually one of the greatest beneficiaries of that period of mutual globalization. If you look at growth rates, I mean, it's unbelievable to think about it in retrospect. Soon after the accession to the WTO, China's growth rates got as high as 14 to 15% per year in 2006, before slowing down because of the financial crisis, and also much more structural reasons as well. And China was able to move from becoming an impoverished country to what it is today, an upper level, middle income country. And gross domestic product, China is now the second largest economy in the world. It surpassed Japan in 2010. And if you look at, what is that called? PPP, purchasing power parity. That's another way of measuring economic size. long to make it simplified, it's actually controlling the value of the dollar and not seeing things in absolute dollar terms. China is actually the world's largest economy since around 2014 or so. So, if you look at these slides, part of what drives Chinese economic growth is the manufacturing prowess. China was able to produce anything and everything. As you see in this slide, huge factories and massive labor force. Um,
I'd
yeah.
actually like to tie this slide into the question I just asked, which is, if this puzzle that you described here fits together so everyone benefits, part of the punchline, part of what we can see coming then is if some of those pieces get realigned, whether it's intentionally or just through the way that evolution happens, as China, is now its GDP is higher than Japan's, is it a Jenga stack? Does everything start to collapse around itself, or does everything have to realign in relation to that?
This is the big question today, right? Can the current model of this manufacturing, this being the factory shop of the world, continue, or should a fundamental realignment occur? And from China's perspective, they do want a fundamental realignment. And I think you're absolutely right, Andy. This is what is causing the tensions that we see today. This is the broader context. So we see manufacturing prowess. Yep. We see this slide right here. Huge workshops of this nature, millions of laborers. And then if we go to the next slide, we see that as a result of manufacturing, we also see the rise of the Chinese consumer, where China is starting to accumulate enough capital in its own right. And part of that capital is starting to be used by newly affluent Chinese to buy things, buy consumer goods from around the world. So you see the Chinese consumer. And you also see the rise of the Chinese investor. And exactly, Mark. It's not, you can say recently, right? In the past 10 or 15 years, China has become a huge investor in many countries around the world, in Southeast Asia, and especially in Africa, where Beijing is using its newly accumulated capital to engage in infrastructure development, to market its own brands, cell phones, stuff of that nature. So China's becoming a big consumer. China's becoming a big investor as the first decade of the 21st century draws to an end. Right? And if we look in the next slide, China, towards the end of the first decade of the 21st century, is starting to develop her own brands and becoming a technologically sophisticated power in her own right. So if we see in this slide here, the Chinese brands began with essentially knockoffs. So Andy, if you could get to the next slide.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I was one behind you. My bad.
Yeah, no problem at all. No problem at all. So initially, it started out with very poor imitations of internationally recognized brands, and it's not just brands of shops that you see here, although they look pretty hilarious with Buckstar Coffee and Hagenbuz, I think. It's also, copycatting technology. So if Apple comes out with an iPhone, there are immediately cheap imitation models of iPhones. If there are, so if whatever was being produced in Europe or the U.S. or Japan that was technologically sophisticated, China would then go ahead and start copying it. But eventually, as this copying continued, by the time you get to 2010 and 2011 or so, you actually start having Chinese brands and Chinese technology that was proprietary, that China owned in its own right. And so if you can see from this model here, China has an equivalent technological company to each of the big technological megacorporations of the US, just to use high tech as an example, right? So I'm not sure how familiar you are with some of these, probably Alibaba, which has really overtaken eBay in terms of auctions, starting out with auctions, but now it's moved into the realm of Amazon with, buying all kinds of goods. So,
And those
yeah,
those
yeah.
dollar values do represent net worth.
They do represent net worth, but I think it's rather dated. This is from a few years back. I mean, one of the things about talking about China post-90s is that things change so quickly that a lot of the stuff that I dig out from Google Images or something to put on the slide, it's already dated. So, so things change incredibly fast. And so you can see from these internet companies that China is attempting to substitute its own companies for those of the U.S. or European megacorporations. Right? So we're now in 2010, and by this point, okay, I think just kind of going off of Andy's earlier comments / questions about, should this be a more fundamental realignment? 2010 was the year when there was severe disagreement over China's future direction. And by 2010, China was at a crossroads. And in both China and the United States, there was division over how the country should proceed. So in China, there were two camps. One was the liberals, and the liberals believed in continued openness, political reforms on the model of the West, and as little interference in markets as possible. So letting markets solve everything. Markets are the solutions to corruption, to social inequality, which there was a lot in China. I mean, I'm not going to go there. That's opening a Pandora's box. We could talk forever. All right. But I just want to say that this voice came under increasing criticism because of the 2008 financial crisis. And in the wake of the financial crisis of 2008, you see the rise of a voice that had been sidelined in China for many, many years. And that was the leftists. The leftists believe in the greater role of the state in the economy. I mean, the leftists do not want to go back to these old days of Mao Zedong, in which, you have the state, setting quotas and everything. But what they want is the state intervening in the economy more, both to promote growth, but also to ensure that growth is equitably distributed. And for the purposes of international relations, preventing multinational companies from dominating crucial economic sectors. So the crucial economic sectors should remain in the hands of state-owned companies. So that's the division in China. In the United States, on the other hand, there was an increasing division in how to view China. Is China a responsible stakeholder in the world economy? Is her growth really beneficial to the world, to globalization, right? This is also coming in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. Or is China an irreconcilable threat? Political, ideological, economic. Should China be stopped? So by 2010 or so, this is what's happening to the global symbiosis. Look at where China is. China used to be the producer of mass consumer items, right? Well, now it had moved up to become producers of middle-end goods and services. So that market has been taken over by China to a large extent. And increasingly, China was looking towards the top, looking towards new technologies like artificial intelligence, to electric cars, to cell phones. So going into the turf of what was once the comfortable dominion of the US, of the European Union, of Japan. And by the way, another big development is that South Korea, with Samsung and other global brand names, it's already moved up into the ranks of the upper tier. So this is actually what's happening in the global symbiosis. It's coming under a lot of stress. So underneath within this context of disagreement, a new leadership assumes the helm of the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Republic. And that's President and Party Secretary Xi Jinping and the Premier Li Keqiang. Li Keqiang, responsible for economic policy, but Xi Jinping in many ways is one of the most powerful and assertive leaders that China has had since Deng Xiaoping. And he came to power striking a balance between the liberals and the leftists. And he continued many practices espoused by the liberals, such as the role of the market in the economy, things of that nature. But at the same time, he believed in a stronger role of the state in encouraging economic growth and in helping China move up the technological tier. Right? So, stage 3. This is the stage where we are at now. It started around 2013. And in that stage, and this is just my interpretation once again, you can feel free to build off of that, and if you come to your own conclusions, that's perfectly fine as well. I'm by no means the final authority on this. But what I'm seeing here in terms of stage 3 is that the Chinese leadership currently has 3 scenarios for dealing with the world. And the Chinese leadership under Xi Jinping is pursuing all 3 simultaneously. All right, so let's look at the first scenario here. The first scenario is China wants a higher status in the US-led world order. So here China is saying, look, we have this economic power, we have this manufacturing power. We want to be given a greater voice in international affairs. Perhaps we might even want to be your equal, right? So if you look at all of the things that are happening in the recent years, the trade wars, the U.S. China trade talks that you see right here. This isn't just about trade. This isn't just about deficits. This is part of a broader competition, if you will, but a competition combined with a conversation about just how China and the United States and other countries in the world can interact with each other in this new world order. Or is it even possible for China and the United States to interact with each other in this world order, right? And so you can see that in addition to the trade talks, there's a bunch of other issues, such as the attempt to force China to let go of state support or subsidies for high tech, the sanctions on Chinese tech companies, especially Huawei. You know, all of these different issues that have plagued bilateral ties. And I just also want to say that, you know, this is where the recent events in Hong Kong, which have been making the headlines in the past few months, and I'm sure, you know, this is probably a very big issue, but you want to also view the events in Hong Kong according to this broader backdrop. Hong Kong's position in the world, and especially in China, and also in the global order, is that Hong Kong acts as a bridge between China and the West. That was its purpose, and its prosperity depended upon providing financial services, providing mediating services such as taking Chinese goods, selling them abroad, or facilitating foreign investment into China. And there's an estimate that about 70% of all foreign investment into China comes through Hong Kong. So Hong Kong's very important, but when China and the United States have tensions and they cannot get along, then for Hong Kong to have these problems, economic problems, political problems, turmoil, it's actually quite natural, even though the events seem to be quite sudden, and there's also legitimate local aspirations as well. But that's the overall context. Okay, so that's scenario number one. And now let's look at the other two scenarios that China is pursuing.
I may have gotten one behind you. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So one more. Yep. And you can see here scenario 2 and 3. They're related to one another. Scenario 2 is a multipolar world. Scenario 3 is a China-centered global order. So what do I mean by multipolar world? Well, if you look in the next slide, this picture here of Xi Jinping with Russian President Vladimir Putin and Iranian President Rouhani. This is basically about having a global order that China sees as more decentered, not centered on one country, but rather with different spheres of influence. So the ideal model that China has in mind is Russia, the European Union, Iran, the U.S., all of these different countries being dominant in specific regions. So that's another aim that China wants, that it tries to pursue concurrently. And of course, scenario 3 is that if China feels that it has enough power, it can take over the world order and call the shots. And so the concrete mechanism for achieving 2 and 3, and also acquiring greater bargaining power for number 1, is the Road and Belt Network. It's also called One Road, One Belt, the Belt and Road Initiative. My God, I think the name changed like a million times ever since its inception in 2013. But essentially what you can see is it's centered around a series of routes by land and by sea that would connect China with the rest of the Eurasian continent and from there to Africa. And this is essentially China's version of globalization. And so the two key ways that China intends to achieve Road and Belt, one is through the railways, infrastructure development of railways across the Eurasian continent. And the secondly is the promotion of shipping. So if we turn our attention to the South China Sea, right? Why is the South China Sea such a huge flashpoint? Because it is a way for China to get out on the seas, and it's also a way for the United States to say, you can get out, but you can only do so at my mercy, right? So the building of islands in the South China Sea. So all this is actually in the service of the Belt and Road Initiative. And so what the US wants to do is to limit or even to cut off this road and belt so that China can return to scenario one and negotiate something that is favorable to the US. I mean, I think the US at this point is not unfavorable to giving China a greater say in the world order. But of course, the US wants more, right? They want to give as little as possible to China, and China wants to get as much as possible. And that's what we're seeing unfolding today. And so finally, in the last slide, another way that China intends to achieve scenarios 2 and 3 is to have an alternative global framework in mind. And this is a backup. This is a backup just in case the US doesn't pan out. And that includes high-tech import substitution. So trying to domesticate all aspects of high-tech production. So there's a big focus right now on chip making, the creation of semiconductor chips. The Asia Investment and Infrastructure Bank, this is a financing system that aims to be independent of the World Bank. International payment system that would be independent of the SWIFT. That's the most common way for banks across the world to transfer money at this point. A Shanghai oil futures exchange that can take the place of New York and London. And then finally, dropping the use of the US dollar in trade with different countries. So Mark mentioned, will the Indian Ocean be the 21st century's focus point as the Pacific? You're right on the mark. Absolutely. Because I think as things are going now in the South China Sea, China pretty much has a firm toehold in the South China Seas. You know, it's got the islands, it's got proximity to China. So China has effectively broken out of the South China Sea. And so the next aim is essentially going to be the Indian Ocean. And you're actually seeing a lot of volatility in the Indian Ocean now. If you look at the Maldives and Sri Lanka, you know, those are key countries in the Indian Ocean. There's been a lot of political jockeying between China, the United States, and also India, because India really doesn't want to see, to be honest, either the US or China, you know, those ships floating around in the Indian Ocean. But I think it's inevitable that it's going to be a focal point in the 21st century. And I think that's a great point to close off. Thank you.
Well, yeah, thank you so much for adding some clarity to this very complicated topic. I wonder, Professor, if you would, tell us a little bit about how you do this work. You know, you've mentioned a couple of times the research you've done. Can you make visible for us your work as an historian? What kinds of resources do you use? What kinds of source materials? How do you approach this particular topic, particularly as it's shifting underneath your feet in your pen, it seems like every year?
Right, Andy. It's not an easy thing to do, to be honest with you, to separate what is political, what is hot in the news, versus a kind of historical perspective. And I would say there are two things. One thing is I consult a lot of archives in the course of my research as a historian. So some of these archives are very old, but other archives tend to be newspapers or magazines, say from the 1920s, 1930s into the 1950s. And looking at these newspapers and magazines, what you find is that it's incredibly easy with historical hindsight to read through them and see what is important and what is not. And so what I do, because I also follow the news a lot, I read a lot. I follow Western media sources. I follow Chinese state media and also more informal Chinese discussion groups. And, what I do is I try to make sense of this barrage of information um, the same way I make sense of archives as well as newspapers. I try to do that. And one way I exercise that kind of historical insight is through teaching my students. And so I teach a modern China course for my undergraduates. The first time it was offered was in 2012. I think it was 2012. So it's around 7 years in the making. And you know what? It's a trial and error process in all of these 7 years, in which every single time I perfect it, and every single time I find it unsatisfactory the next time I go around it. And so I just keep on doing it until I have a framework in mind. And as I mentioned to you earlier, even with this one, I will take the PowerPoint and what I've shared with you today, and I'm going to improve on it because I'm going to teach it again in 2020. So I
Yeah.
really appreciate this platform.
Absolutely. And maybe one final question. We're almost out of time. And again, I'd encourage all of our participants to chime in with any last comments or questions. But, I offered at the beginning the ways in which I believe, and I suspect you do, I'm positive that Deb does, that we're offering the humanities as a tool to understand this complicated world, in this case, history. That there's a way through this discipline to better understand what's happening currently and perhaps even see into the future a little bit, or at least make some educated guesses of what's coming. Are you optimistic, given that? Are you optimistic that our current United States culture, and I don't mean this as a political question necessarily, but do we as a country understand what you've just shared? Do we understand the complexity of China? Are you optimistic about the ways in which we're interacting with China?
That's a great question, Andy, and it's an incredibly deep one.
Mm.
Gives me a lot of food for thought. Optimistic, if I'm optimistic about how we understand China in the United States, and what should I say? I think we should have more people, who could reach out, who could understand the complexity of China. I think we should have many more people, and not just many more people, but many more people who can be able to enter actual policy making circles, people who make decisions. at the very top. Because I think in academia, in education, a lot of us understand China in very nuanced ways. And I think the key thing is about bringing that understanding of China, bringing that insight from the humanities. And this is also an advertisement for how important the humanities are. Bringing the critical thinking and the insights in the humanities and trying to make it actually work for society, for politics, and for facilitating greater understanding between the two countries. Because I think moving into the 21st century, this is the most important bilateral relationship in the world. I mean, if you screw up this relationship, I mean, God knows, I don't even want to think about it, And the thing is, there's a lot of talent in the U.S. There's a lot of knowledge, and just also looking at the questions in the chat box, it's incredibly illuminating for me. But how do we really translate this into something that can really work? I think that's the challenge.
Yeah, and you just said in your answer, I appreciate your earnestness there, but I heard you say, and it sort of it underscored for me that you said it was the most important bilateral relationship by far, right? And that's the one we
Yeah.
can't screw up. And that's a pretty fantastic thing to say.
Yeah, and there was also a question by Timothy about religious diversity and liberty. I think in this current state, with the tension between China as well as the outside world, I think the tendency has been towards greater state control over religion. And Xinjiang, of course, is the most obvious example, right? But you see this happening in other parts of China towards Chinese Muslims, Muslims who are not Uyghur. There's been a big crackdown, and I think it's not purely because of religion, but because of the association of Islam with terrorism, with ISIS, with a lot of the threats taking place in the Near and Middle East. Because if you look at Xinjiang's position, it's right next to Afghanistan. It's very close to Iran and Iraq, and that's why there's such high-handed policies. Michael's question was about growing wealth inequality. This is actually one key reason why Xi Jinping came to power and implemented a lot of the policies that he did, because there was a consensus in the Chinese leadership that simply letting markets do the job was not going to be sufficient. Even today, there's a lot of corruption, there's a lot of wealth gap in China, and there's a lot of fear, that if that were to continue, there would be a lot of social unrest. And Mark, yeah, engagement and deterrence, and how to effectively deal with the challenge, but at the same time, not to let the challenge overtake the U.S., but somehow engaging with that challenge in a positive manner, in a way that we can find another way for a win-win situation rather than a zero-sum game.
Well, thank you again. I'm actually going to chime in and say that I am optimistic, and I'm optimistic mostly because the ways in which you've shared this. Now we have educators across the country who are able to build off of this, and as you said earlier, it's finding that common understanding that may be the key to solving this great challenge. Professor, thank you so much for leading this conversation tonight. We really do appreciate you joining us. Thank you again.
Thank you very much. I learned a lot.
And I want to thank Deb Cunningham and Primary Source one more time for being our co-sponsor tonight. And I want to thank all of you for joining us. National Humanities Center can be followed on social media, particularly our Twitter feeds and our Facebook pages, if you like to get current updates and announcements for upcoming initiatives. Again, tonight's session has been recorded and it's usually online within about 24 hours, 48 hours, I should say, so that you can go back and watch it a little bit more slowly and maybe take some deeper notes and share it perhaps with your students. I hope to see many of you at our next session. This is our last one for the fall semester. On December 12th, this coming Thursday, we'll be working with Erica Lee from University of Minnesota on a session titled Asian Americans, A History of the Fastest Growing Group in the United States. In just a moment, I'm going to open the evening evaluation. Please take a moment and complete that before you log off. And once you do so, you'll get a certificate for your attendance tonight. Thank you again for joining us. We very much enjoy your conversation and your contributions. Have a great day at school tomorrow. If I don't see you at the next webinar, have a wonderful holiday break. Thank you again. We'll see you next time at the Humanities in Class webinar series. Good night, everyone.